I've come to this revelation that anybody who is not going completely insane right now is like a hero. Like seriously, climate apocalypse, like election apocalypse, like inflation, like the pandemic is still going on. Like anybody who's like sort of keeping it together, like you are a fucking hero if you're sort of keeping it together. And actually having this revelation makes me like less mad at like little things like, oh, okay, look, that person's just like, they're barely keeping it together. But you know what? Everyone's barely keeping it together. I don't know if you feel that way.
I feel that way. I mean, I definitely like, it's the most cliche thing in the world, but the serenity prayer is really key to me. Like, what can I control? What can I not? Because I think sometimes you end up in this position where it's like, it's up to me. You know, I take the job I have very seriously. It's like, I have to like save American democracy. And it's like, I can't control any outcomes. I can't control any outcomes. I could do good work. I could focus on what I can control. But if I try to focus on things outside my control, I will go insane. And so I really try not to, but it's very tempting to be drawn into worrying about things you can't control. I cannot control most of the things that I worry about. And I just try to keep retelling myself that because it's the only way that I can stay sane. But yes, the pull is very strong not to stay sane.
Right. And the other thing is that knowing that you can't control those things is an insanity creator when the things you can't control are like super terrifying and scary. Like, you know, like climate apocalypse and fascism and like, I mean, like
those two. Those are the top of the list.
Right. So it's kind of like insane creating to know you can't control it. I mean, I kind of use it for the climate. I kind of use the metaphor. It's not even a metaphor. It's actually true. We're on a spaceship. The life support system is burning. Lots of us know the life support system is burning. Yeah. The people in the cockpit of the spaceship, in large part, have decided to bar the door closed and allow the life support system to burn. And you're like, yo, we're all on the spaceship here. What like, and it's amazing that you can be on the spaceship knowing that's happening and remain, you know, mildly sane. And it goes for inflation and it goes for the election. So let's get right into the election. Let's just get right into that. We reported here at The Lever that Republicans have spent $44 million on TV ads focused on the economy and inflation since Labor Day. During the same time, Democrats only spent about $12 million on ads focused on the economy, less than 7% of the party's total. Why do you think up until now, Democrats have not been talking as aggressively about the economy, even when it's statistically, according to the same polls, the most important issue to voters?
I mean, I think there's two reasons, right? One is that there's always this question of what the issue space is going to be and how much you can define it. So I do think that, like, I think it was a perfectly reasonable and I think effective for a while tactical decision after Dobbs to be like, look, we just got handed an issue that we own 65-35 in an environment where we didn't have this, and also that we care about. We should take advantage of this because if you're the party in power and 8% on inflation, it's an uphill battle, right? So you have to tell some kind of story. And I think some people have. And I think actually the stuff that Biden's been doing about the fact that like they will cut Social Security and Medicare and want to do that and are announcing it ahead of time. I think they probably should have focused on that earlier. But I always think it's this tricky thing where it's like, it's not just what your message is, it's what issue are you bringing attention to at a given moment. And when you're the incumbent party, and again, this is the brilliance of running an opposition campaign when inflation's 8%. You don't have to do anything or say anything or have any solution. Like literally Todd Young, the senator from Indiana, like just has a picture of him at night, like filling up his car isn't even in the frame. He's like at a gas station. He's like $4 gas. It's like that's it. That's like literally the sum of the message.
Right. And by the way, the response should be like, dude, why aren't you talking to your oil donors about this?
And I think, look, I do think the kind of populist message on this stuff and the stuff that I think Katie Porter has trotted out and Elizabeth Warren, which is like, there's price gouging, there's profits going to the top. Even if I think like, as a macroeconomic analysis, there's like arguments to be had about how much that's the driving factor. At a political level, you got to give people something. The other thing I'll say that's like really depressing to me, and it's something I've really changed my mind about. You don't get any credit for stuff that you did. You just don't. And again, like I've just come around entirely on this. You do stuff because it's good for a few reasons. You do stuff because you deliver stuff because you believe in it. It also builds longer term, durable political benefits, right? Like you see how hard it is to take away the ACA. You see how Medicaid expansion. You'll see how hard it will be to claw back the student debt stuff, right? So that in a broader political sense, all that stuff is good. It's good policy and good politics. In the narrow sense of like, does it help you win the election? I don't think it does. Like, I just think that stuff like basically comes out in the wash. People are focused on their problems. Understandably, that's how democracy works. And so, you know, I saw this great write-up in Politico where they were like talking about like some pollster like testing like messages on like, here's all we accomplished. And it was like the lowest testing message. People were like, I do not want to hear it. And I don't blame them for not wanting to hear it. It's like, it sucks when prices go up 8% and rent particularly is like through the roof. So I totally get that. But I do think it's a difficult terrain to message in. To come back to your original question, I think the tactical play they made a lot of sense. There was a lot of data to suggest it. I do think that like in the last month of the election, you have to talk about the economy.
I want to reiterate like your point about the permanent campaign. That is always what I internalize that term to me. That's an old political term, the permanent campaign. And the permanent campaign isn't a campaign to be like, hey, look what we did. Hey, look, every election, especially now, is essentially a grievance election. And
what
the
are
Democratic
you pissed off about?
Exactly. What are you mad about? And the Republicans are happy and have perfected the art of naming the alleged bad guy. I just want to underscore the alleged. I don't agree with who they name as the bad guy. But like, they're very good at being like, this is the problem and this is the bad guy. And the Democrats, even though they're in power, I'm sure they're like, we can't campaign on the economy and inflation because we're the ones, who are in control. But it's like, that's not true. Like Donald Trump could figure out a way to run a campaign against inflation when he was the president, if that was the problem. Like it's the issue of like, are you willing to call out villains? And tell me if you think I'm wrong. I think the Democrats they're sort of uncomfortable with calling out any other villain other than maybe like Fox News and like the Republican Party writ large, but they're not comfortable calling out like sort of specific villainous companies or even really specific villainous industries.
I think that's generally right. I think there's like the oil companies and the Saudis are a great set of villains, right? From a political narrative perspective. They're also like the people who are genuinely benefiting from the spike in oil prices. I think they're individuals are in individual settings, but they are not willing to wage campaigns on it. Like that I think is, I think you could have seen a big oil is screwing you by gouging prices.
That's the one I've been waiting for, man. I mean, really, because it's the Republican donors. And when you look at the campaign finance reports,
they're like 3 to 1.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah. So it's not like, right. So there's lots of places like, there's lots of places where Democrats end up cross-pressured by their donor base.
Yes.
Oil isn't really one of them. Like the energy sector, particularly like even, the real people who are making a mint right now, who are also coming in to pump a lot of oil are the sort of mid-level producers who are like the most conservative, most Republican donor. Like they're more conservative than the big firms.
Yes.
But the other thing here too, and again, this is like the Mohammed bin Salman problem, and ultimately like a huge problem about having your whole political economy dependent on fossil fuels is they need these people to pump oil. I mean, Joe Biden needs them. Like these same people that you're going to, that I think it's good politics to go after in your ads are the people that you need to be like actually pumping more oil to bring prices down. Because if there's one thing that determines people's political mood, it's the price of oil. And this is something that I think is so important at a political economy level over and above the climate is like getting to a universe where this is not the central factor. I mean, you see it all across Europe right now. Like it's so determinative.
Sure. But let me push back and ask you, it's not like being nice to the oil companies. Like,
is going to make
we're not going to air ads and we're going to be super nice to you. Like that doesn't matter. Like they got like the smartest numbers crunchers in the world being like, we're going to pump this much and this much.
That's
and this is out. Right. Like, so it doesn't, the political ads that they could air doesn't matter. And like, I actually feel like
it does matter a little bit with the Saudis. I think there's more of an explicit thing with the Saudis, who also I think are a great foil, like you know what I mean?
Sure.
So I think there's more of a like,
sure,
that's a more, but you're right. Like when you're talking about these mid-sized firms, like they're making calculations not based on who's running ads against.
Right. So my question then is, let's go a little deeper here. Tell me if you think my theory is wrong, that the reason the Democrats don't like to name villains, the reason they don't run permanent campaigns, use the bully pulpit to really consistently name villains, traces back not only to their campaign donors and just, healthcare, pharma, et cetera, but also even with somebody like the oil companies that they don't get a lot of money from. It goes back to something about norms. It goes back to something about like the elite discourse, and we don't want to be portrayed as anti-business, and we need to be portrayed as like serious parties, serious non-fascist, non-demagogic leaders.
Yep.
They don't bash in a populist, of course, that word has now become bad. They don't bash in a populist way like an industry. It's primitive. It's not cool. It's sort of anti-norms. I feel like that undergirds a lot of democratic culture. Fair or not?
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. I mean, I think that's like both institutional norms. I think there's like a temperamental aspect to it too. I mean, you'll see them, like people will, when they're in a corner, people will find the right targets to go after.
Right. That's why. But you see, Biden belatedly now is like, the oil companies are like ripping us off. It's like, oh, you 2 weeks from the election.
Right. It's a little bit of like a break glass kind of thing. But you're right. There's a resistance there.
Yeah.
And again, like I do think all of this. It's interesting. You're talking about populism and that being a bad word. I do think like the weirdness of the political rhetoric and the sort of authoritarian impulses have spun people around on all this stuff, where people are very like wary about who are they dividing against and how and what those lines are. But I also think like there's ways to do that are like totally legitimate and not like abusive of the public,
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I think like when you see Katie Porter as an example, she's not violating norms. She's like,
no, she's like, here's the profit. Here's where the profits are coming from in pricing power.
Making powerful people uncomfortable is not a violation of norms when it's the powerful people who are creating the problems. Okay, that's a good segue to my next question, which is about the Supreme Court. We talked about abortion. Obviously, that's of even more heightened importance right now. Public trust in the Supreme Court, all-time low. We know that the court feels itself that it has a legitimacy problem. On a recent episode, even of Pod Save America, former President Barack Obama said if we reform the Supreme Court simply by figuring out ways to get more Democrats on there and stack it up, then it's not going to solve the legitimacy problem of the Supreme Court. It's just that we'll win more cases for a while. So clearly, even he is acknowledging kind of very establishment, institutional voice of the party, that the Supreme Court has a legitimacy problem. Why do you think the party leadership has been very, very hesitant to kind of make a political argument about the court as an institution beyond just saying it's like there's a discordance between like the court is ruining the entire world, which I effectively believe on climate, abortion, et cetera, right. And like, hey, we're not really prepared to do much of anything other than say like we got to get a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate to put maybe one more judge on the court, not to actually structurally take it on. What is the hesitance to do this?
Well, I think there's a few things. One, I think to go back to your temperamental norm thing, I think like Biden is just like doesn't like that. Like I just think, and that's deep. I think that's not like a political calculation. I think that's like in his core.
Former chairman of the Judiciary Committee. He's like 5,000 years.
Yeah. And I think actually like this is a thing I think that you would probably agree with is just like, I do think people underestimate the role ideology has in politicians. Like they really like, they have their donors and they have political calculations, but they actually do believe in things. Sometimes they believe in really wrong things, or things I think are wrong, but they really do believe in them and they will pursue those beliefs sometimes to great cost. I mean, by not taking rhetorical paths that would be politically advantageous and so I think that to get back to your original point about sort of norms and things like that, I do think that's a huge part of it. So that's A. B, it's also a little bit of this, if you don't have the votes, which they don't, right? Like, it's a little bit of like threatening to shoot a hostage you can't shoot, right? If you're making a big threat about we're going to expand the court, and it's like, well, we know that Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema aren't going to, they're not even going to overturn this filibuster. They sure as hell aren't going to do it to like expand the court. It's like, what are you threatening, right? Although I will say, I do think threatening has its own civic role in making the court a little worried, which I don't think would be the worst thing, because right now there's not a lot of checks on the court. So I think in like a constitutional sense, the interplay between power of the different branches, even if you can't do it, making noise about doing it might actually serve as a kind of useful check on some of the court's worst impulses at this point.
You're speaking my language. I am like in the middle of Jeff Schessel's book, Supreme Power, Franklin Roosevelt versus the Supreme Court. This is what
which is
like,
right.
Which is
ultimate example of that.
Yes. And you know, what's interesting about that is that it is sort of, I feel like the memory of that, or nobody, you know, most people aren't old enough to remember that. I don't think, you know, but I guess the created memory of that is like FDR screwed up by challenging the court. And I don't think it's necessarily exactly the opposite. Like, it was a huge, like, clear win for him, but he definitely got some things out of that court by having that fight. And so it just speaks to your point about like threatening carefully with precision actually does have a utility, even if you don't have a hostage to act on.
Well, and I think for folks that are not familiar, right? Like, the court packing was the Supreme Court kept overturning huge parts of New Deal legislation. FDR was like, enough, we're going to add more justices to the court. There was a huge fight over this. It was actually quite unpopular. Like, we have polling from the time, and people didn't like it. They thought it was overreach. Ultimately, though, before he ever kind of has to do it, or the question is called, like, the court kind of changes its jurisprudence. And there's always been this long political debate and historical debate about, like, was that coincidence? Was it accident? Did they realize what's happening? But the thing I would say about that episode, and I totally agree with you, it's a really important one, is two things happen. One is that I agree that like it was more successful than history records as like Roosevelt overreach, but also like he spent political capital. Like, it was you know what I mean? And like, that's the other thing about it. Like, if you're going to have a fight over the court, like, some people will think you're overreaching. Some people will, you know, fight against you. So it's not a casual fight, right? It's like you're either in or you're like, that's right. Yeah. That's right. It's not a casual fight. And so you got to think about where that political capital gets spent, which I think is the third reason, honestly, that it's been deprioritized, even though it's like, I agree with you, like, and it's probably one of the biggest threats.
Okay, I'm going to ask you some media related questions, because obviously you are in the media. And I'm going to ask you some, like, hopefully these aren't uncomfortable questions, but if they are, you know, here we go. Okay, like, you're at a network that has focused a lot on the January 6th situation, the threat to democracy, which, to be very clear, I think the January 6th riot and the threat to democracy are really important issues. But the latest Ipsos poll shows that only about 7% of Americans think this is the most important issue in the election. We talked about that, the economy, there's an inflation crisis, et cetera. So I guess one question is, do you think, if not only specifically cable TV news, but cable TV news as part of a kind of fragmented media and the ratings incentives, the click incentives with relatively fragmented small audiences, you know, not 25 Super Bowl level audiences. Do you think that contributes to or creates the incentive system for a discourse that like doesn't focus on, for instance, macroeconomic issues, or there's more of an incentive to focus in on something like a more cinematic, like the January 6th and the threat to democracy? Are those incentives? Is there a problem there?
I mean, I'm writing a book about this right now, so I've literally a book's length of thoughts. I mean, first of all, I would say the attentional incentives draw on everyone. In fact, the intentional incentives that I used to find the most intense in cable news are now on everyone. Every Patreon, every podcast, every TikToker, everyone is fighting in the same intentional battle. And you will see, like, it's like, wait, why is this Twitch streamer beefing with this Twitch streamer all of a sudden? I thought they were just doing a thing about, like, either politics. And it's like, no, because they need eyeballs. And, like, what gets eyeballs is beef. So it's like everyone is operating under some set of attentional incentives. Those intentional incentives are also going to be very different than what pollsters say is, quote, the most important, right? So there's like a few things going on. One is like, I used to tell young journalists all the time, when you're pitching something, like, it's not enough to be a topic, it's got to be a story, right? So it's like, yes, what's the number one story? Like, prices are up. What's the attentionally dynamic way to tell that story? And we've seen it. Like, if you watch local news, here's the family that their milk is up. And like, but what people find, quote, most important to poll and what they will attentionally adhere to is going to be different. And then I also think, like, I've been doing this for 10 years now. I think cable news is good at drawing attention to some things and not good at drawing attention to other things. Partly because it's operating in a medium that has these attentional incentives and constraints. So like big climactic battles, like whether America is going to be a democracy, which to me is like broader than January 6th, but that is like part of it, is a story that we're actually relatively good at telling in a way that fits the genre. Like, I also have a podcast. I'm writing a book. Like, I'm actually working on like a TV show, and all of those kind of find different ways to like tell different stories. But like, yeah, cable news is not great. I would not say that like the intentional incentives and also the medium itself are best disposed to give, like, I think what we think of as the old evening news or the old newspaper, which is like, here are all the stories in the world, or like all the news that fits the print. It never functions that way. And I also think that's why people should not just get their news from cable news, which I say to people all the time. Like, the scary thing is that everybody now is under those same incentives. So like, I'm not even sure anyone has the incentives anymore, particularly as audiences fracture. If 30 million people are going to watch you at night, and you have those 30 million, and maybe if you go away, maybe not, it's like, you can do like, here's the news of the day. But if you're fighting and scrapping for each of those 10,000 viewers at the margin, like, it gets a lot harder to be like, here's what happened with the election in Kenya.
Sure. So I guess then the question with that is a good segue. Are there examples where you wanted to do a set of stories that you either feared would not generate the attention that the kind of incentive system, the demands of your job require, or even more heavy-handedly where the bosses were like, dude, you got to be covering this and not this. And you're like, but over here, this other thing is like super important and I want to cover. I mean, this comes up, the climate, that always comes up in the sort of discourse about media coverage of the climate. Like, why aren't they covering climate, right? So I'm just wondering, are there specific situations or examples or even topics where you're like, I want to cover this more. I know we need to cover this more. I have at least on a day-to-day level, a built-in audience. It's not going to leave tomorrow, right? Like I want to do this, and the pressure system, the higher ups, the incentive system is just like, no, you can't do that. You've got to be over here.
Basically never the higher ups. Like the attentional incentives are, and people see this who write for a living. Like, you can see like what stories get clicked.
Sure.
Like,
Absolutely.
Like, that like some topics just, people don't click on them. And like, that's true of a lot of things. I mean, the biggest thing that's true of is climate. Like, the biggest thing I wrestle with is how to productively cover climate. And I think that's in some ways gotten a little easier, partly because like weather disasters have gotten more persistent. But the biggest problem for me with climate at a sort of attentional level is just not it being doom. Like, you could just say like, here's another example of how we're screwed, and here's another example of how we're screwed. And like, we even have this thing where we like try to do these sort of like bad news, good news when we do them, so that there's some takeaway. Like, we did a thing about the Italian heat pump program, which is awesome. They're basically like subsidizing people to buy heat pumps.
Yep.
But yes, like, do we cover climate as much as climate is worthy of news? Like, of course not. Does anyone? Like, probably not. But then here's the other thing. There are climate focused publications that do great work, right?
Sure.
But like, it's hard to get millions of people to watch that.
All right, let me push back though. Let me ask you what the difference then. If the old adage in news all the way, it's such an adage in news that it's like, it makes me think of Anchorman and like old local news, right? If it bleeds, it leads.
Bleeds, it leads, right?
Like, okay. And like local news is typically like cliche local news is like crime, right? Local crime. It's always like crime.
Still
okay.
now.
Okay, right. And crime in some ways is a fundamentally doomer kind of story. Like somebody got robbed, somebody got killed over and over and over again. Right. So I guess the question then is if that's a successful ratings model for local news, why would climate doom or climate disaster not be a successful ratings model for local news, national news? And by the way, I just want to be clear. I'm not I think doomerism is a separate problem, but just on the apples to apples comparison, why not?
I mean, I focus on this a lot, right? Like it's the diffuseness of it. So it's a little bit of like if you compare climate to coronavirus, I think. Like people, like we'll lose like way more people this week than we'll lose to homicide. Like way more. Way more.
Mm-hmm.
Does it have the same dramatic impact? No. Is it playing the same role when you ask people like, what are you most concerned about? COVID is like the bottom. It's still killing way more factors of people than homicide.
That's crazy to think about. I mean, you're right. I mean, it's like crazy. So why?
Right. So why? Because people like it just and this has always been the struggle of climate is that like crime, there's something about personal threat of another person that's different than, as we just learned literally, of a virus or a molecule of carbon. Now, I do think the one place where this has changed and which is true is that like people love weather. Like they love weather. And I think and I do think the thing that has changed for the better is that weather disaster coverage, which does rate people are interested in, has gotten much more climate imbued in the last, like, I'd say 3 or 4 years. Like we've always done it through that lens, but I think now it becomes more and more, part of the mainstream way that it's understood.
Dude, I'm coming to you from Denver where we got Mike Nelson, the local weather guy, is like Mr. Climate guy, right? Like that's a big win, right? So that's a really good point.
And it used to be the opposite.
Totally.
The weathermen used to be like the most reactionary anti-climate like caucus on earth.
Yeah.
So that I think is a big thing, but like I don't know. I don't think I've ever like solved the attentional Rubik's Cube of climate. And we've tried a bunch of different ways. There's different ways of telling the story, but it's a hard one.
Your show, along with other MSNBC shows, focuses a decent amount of attention on Fox News, right-wing media. The presumed goal has been to basically educate the audience on its lack of credibility, its partisan nature, et cetera, et cetera. But, the question of whether there's already been buy-in from like the MSNBC audience. And in the meantime, Fox News has gotten bigger and stronger. One question I always wonder about is what is the utility of whether it's MSNBC, I'm not just, isolating that sort of left of center media constantly scandalizing, by the way, on the merits, right? I agree with it, like Fox News and the right-wing media is an evil force, but what is the utility of it? Is there a political utility of it? Because I feel like everybody who watches your show kind of basically knows that Fox News is like, essentially evil, misleading, not accurate, and sort of incendiary in a horrible way. Like, what's the utility of it? Is there a utility of it?
I think there's two utilities. One is that like sometimes people say things that are wrong that you want to correct. I mean, just in the same way that like you like argue with people on Twitter or you argue with people on blogs. It's like, this person said that like they think there's weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And it's like, here's the reason I don't think there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Okay,
like,
so just like straight correcting the record.
Yeah, like just fighting, just public debate, which I think is the other thing I do think is true is like I do honestly think people who don't we monitor it much more than our audience does. And like some of the stuff is like really wildly insidious and people need to like the vaccine stuff I think like isn't really fully appreciated.
Yes.
Like we have the lowest levels of vaccination of any peer country. We have just seen white deaths surpass the deaths of people of color. We're seeing like it's coming out in this like stark lives terms. Like more people are dying, more white older people are dying in the most conservative parts of the country because, like, causally 100%
Mm-hmm.
of the messaging that has been primarily from Fox hammered into people.
Yep.
And I think it's like, at some level, you can't really understand what's going on in the country. Like, when you look at the numbers, you look at our vaccination numbers, it's like, what is up with Americans? And it's like, part of the answer to that question is that one of the most powerful media platforms has just been telling people to do a thing that's going to make them more likely to die. And it's one of the sickest things I've ever seen in my life.
I mean, listen, man, when I talk to my brother who's a physician about this topic, like, he can barely not like keep from being in a rage because he sees it in the hospital every day. Like, he sees people dying. The thing that's crazy, I was talking to a friend about this. The thing that's so crazy, and your point is about Fox is so on point, is like, here is actually an amazing success story of the dysfunctional public health system in America. We created a vaccine with government
Even the
support.
Trump administration, if you want to like propagandize for them, just say it.
Like a free, life-saving vaccine, super quick, somehow freely available, widely available in a country whose public health infrastructure is otherwise a joke, right? Like, this is a huge success story. And there's a large part of the population that is paying attention to this media machine that's like, no, we actually don't, this huge success, we actually don't want, like, get it out of my face. Like, I don't want it. And now we see the results, and the results, the higher death rates, even that hasn't woken people up. And I do think you're right. It does go back in part to what you are plugged into on a daily basis. I think that's a fair point.
I would say, I mean, I've been saying this for a while, that like the vaccine to me is like the perfect encapsulation of America and all its contradictions, which is like this incredible achievement, like born of the fruits of labor from people from different parts of the world, including immigrants and the public sector and the private sector, right? Like big pharma and the government and all these things coming together to like, and our top scientific researchers all coming together to create this miracle. And then like people just be like, no, screw that. I don't want the magic pill that you have that would like help me, you know. And then, here's the last thing I would say, which I think actually like unites this whole conversation, which is that like the thing I've also learned about Fox, and you see this in the, you know, conservative world, they're all chasing attention too. Like, as much as the reason they're doing the vaccine stuff is because that's what their audience wants. It's much less they're commanding them. Like, everyone is on the chase side.
Well, it's like symbiotic. It's symbiotic. It's like they create the demand, and then
But it's more chasing than you would realize, right? Like, it's like even they can't just, and you saw this, the place you saw is the 2016 primary, where they wanted to be like, do not vote for Donald Trump. They wanted to like tell their audience, like, no, not this guy. And they couldn't do it.
I want to ask one last question about the changing of Democratic politics to bring this whole conversation full circle. We're 2 weeks before an election. It has been 6 years since the end of the Obama administration. With 2020 hindsight, knowing about the financial crisis, the bailout, the sort of social discontent with people, millions of people being thrown out of their homes, seeing that while also watching on their TV, bankers getting bailed out, the ACA being touted as this great success, now health insurance prices going up 24%. The discontent from that, I believe, helped create the conditions for the Trump MAGA movement. And I wonder if you think there is any reevaluation in the Democratic media space, the Democratic Party as a whole, of the veneration of either Obama himself or really Obamaism, neoliberalism that led us to this moment. Like, is there a willingness to kind of reevaluate the things that got us to this moment? Or do you think that's just like not a kind of thing that people, liberals, whatever you want to, Democrats want to even think about? Or do you think things are like changing a little bit? Like, if not, there's an explicit awareness of what's happened, that there's kind of an implicit shift.
Well, I think Trump's election changed the way that period is going to be looked at forever. I mean, I think there's a cardinal sin of those years, and it's born partly of the people around Barack Obama, partly of the Fed, but just there was an enormous, more than the bailouts, more than anything, the failure to achieve full employment and to try to get to full employment as rapidly as possible. That's partly born of the austerity measures that come when the Republicans take the House. It's partly born of Ben Bernanke. It's partly born of the people around Barack Obama and worried about deficits and pivoting to deficits. But the central failure was being told you can't get back to full employment when in fact you could have. And I think if you got back, if that recovery wasn't the grinding, terrible recovery it was for years, the politics of the country would be better. Full stop. So that to me is like the big cardinal error. Even though there's individual things like the way they handled mortgages, which was terrible and all that stuff. But the bigger thing to me is like, you got to look at it in international context, which is like, this happened everywhere. Now, partly you could say it happened everywhere because neoliberalism happened everywhere, but like the crisis, its aftermath, and the rise of right-wing authoritarian movements and sort of hard right politics has happened in basically every country across the West and outside. And I think like the causes for that are just bigger than, they're even bigger than neoliberalism. I mean, I think a lot of them have to do with the aftermath of the crisis and the ideological exhaustion of neoliberalism as a model. But I think there's a whole bunch of other factors that have produced it. And I think like in terms of reassessment, it's like the thing about presidents is always like compared to what? Like it's just, you know, it's like a class with a curve. It's like, you know, better than Trump, not as good as FDR, better than LBJ on some things, worse on others, probably better than Clinton. Like, you know, I think the healthiest way to look at presidents is always like understanding what, you know, where they are in that set. But the most important thing I think to draw from that period, and in a weird way, a lesson completely learned by the Democratic Party that they are now paying for through the nose, is full employment, full employment, full employment. All of the things that they got wrong, the last crisis, a lot of them they got right this time. They passed the ARP and they have pushed this economy to 3.5% unemployment. Rapid, the fastest growing jobs we've ever seen. More union and labor power than has ever been seen in my lifetime. And people hate it because there's 8% unemployment. So part of it too is just like, you never get the same set of challenges twice, you know? And like, that has been like a really wild thing for me to watch as someone who has so many scars from the deficit full employment battles of 2009, where there are all these people saying nonsense who are wrong, and all of us shouting that this is madness, and we could have a much faster recovery. We shouldn't be talking about deficits. We shouldn't be talking about austerity. There's all this demand. There's all this bad debt. We need to get people back to work. We need to stimulate to win that intellectual battle, and then find yourself in a macroeconomic environment in the next Democratic administration, which ends up being almost the inverse, where it's like the fastest recovery than ever, unemployment at 3.5%, more jobs created than ever, huge amounts of stimulus spending, $5 trillion over the course of 2 years. Totally unimaginable in scale to me back in 2009. And now you got 8% unemployment and high home and gas prices, and people like, this sucks.
I do think that at the beginning of Biden's term, he definitely learned some of those lessons from the early Obama years and put them into play when the American Rescue Plan, I have said from the beginning, was like one of the best things that has ever happened legislatively, frankly, in my lifetime. Like, I can't really remember any piece of legislation that has been that dramatic and that much of essentially a divorce from the austerity ideology. Like, it was like, actually, we're going to intervene in the economy and actually directly help people in the middle and at the bottom instead of helping sprinkling stuff at the top. Yep. And my fear is, and maybe I'll ask you one last quick question. My fear is, if the Democrats lose the Congress in the election, the Republicans have said they want to cut Social Security and Medicare, and I'm sure they'll bring out some nice sounding banner called it entitlement reform, quote unquote. And Joe Biden has been warning about this, but I have a long memory. And I remember Joe Biden sort of fetishizing the idea of a grand bargain. to do quote unquote entitlement reform for 40 years. That's just a matter of record. Now, maybe Joe Biden has changed, but I wonder, to ask you to speculate just a little bit, like, do you think there's a danger that like Republicans get into Congress, Biden is still the president, Biden, you know, like every like Bill Clinton in 94 after the 94 election, sort of like a sort of impulse to triangulate. And Biden is like, you know what? I have a chance for this grand bargain on cutting Social Security or raising the retirement age. I have a chance to do this, something that I've pushed for 40 years that I've never had in my entire life. And maybe this is are we going to enter a situation where the next thing we're going to hear about is another Bowles-Simpson commission? But now with the Republicans in Congress who want to do it and a Democratic president. Am I like crazy to like be concerned about that?
You're not crazy, but I think I think first of all, it is literally more likely of like a default, which I think is like the real tail risk I'm worried about, because I don't think Republicans have any incentive to do anything other than make the economy terrible. Like, why would they? They're trying to get Donald Trump and a Republican elected in 2024. Like, what will increase the odds of that? The economy being terrible. Like, I just don't. So partly like my bigger worry is that A. B, I think 10 years ago, I'd be more worried. I just think that things have changed in the Democratic coalition so much. And I do think that Joe Biden retains enough raw political sense, which I think has been on display with the use of the strategic petroleum reserve to get those gas prices down and the student debt announcement. I think he retains enough just like old school transactional sense of political astuteness that he understands that would be a terrible misstep politically.
Chris, thank you so much for taking the time with us. Thank you for taking all of my questions. Hopefully they didn't make you uncomfortable at all. And I should say, thank you for being the kind of
big boy.
Yeah, you are.
I'm a big boy.
And thanks for being the kind of person who, like, over many years, you and I have had these discussions, and I appreciate you doing it for our podcast. Thanks, man.
You bet.